Most people alive on the 22nd of November 1963 can remember where they were and what they were doing when news reached them of the assassination of the American President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy, of celebrated Irish descent, once remarked that if more politicians knew poetry and more poets knew politics, the world would be a better place in which to live. As chance would have it, on that very same day in '63, an Irish poet who had been driven into exile in America because of his concern with politics, died in Massachusetts. That poet was Patrick MacGill, the Navvy poet of Glenties, County Donegal. I'm going back to Glenties when the harvest fields are brown and the autumn sunset lingers on my little Irish town. When the gossamer is shining where the moorland blossoms blow, I'll take the road across the hills I tramped so long ago. 'Tis far I am beyond the seas, but yearning voices call, will you not come back to Glenties and your wave-washed Donegal? I've seen the hopes of childhood stifled by the hand of time. I've seen the smile of innocence become the frown of crime. I've seen the wrong rise high and strong. I've seen the fair betrayed, until the faltering heart fell low, the brave became afraid. But still the cry comes out to me, the homely voices call from the glen among the highlands of my ancient Donegal. The controversy which once surrounded MacGill's work is tempered now by a week-long annual summer school held in the poet's honour. Its founder and director is Dr. Joe Mulholland.
Well, Patrick MacGill was born locally here, just down the road at Mullaghmore. He was born into a very small farm. There was a very large family, 11 children, one of whom died. Conditions were very poor indeed. So he took the road that most kids at the time took in this county. That is, he went to the hiring fair. The children had to be got off. They got a very rudimentary education. They went to school part of the year at most, and then they were shifted off to earn their living in the Lagan, what was called the Lagan, which was Strabane, Omagh, all that area. So the young MacGill was hired in Strabane at the age of 11. And then they spent periods of 6 months. They were hired for 6 months for about a fiver. From there, the usual pattern was that they went to Scotland then, when they got a bit older as teenagers, to the Tattyhoken fields and worked for farmers there. And indeed, again, conditions were very controversial at the time. They lived in what were called bothies, and MacGill was no different. From there, he went to working as a navvy on the railway, the Greenock-Glasgow railway line. And miraculously, he began writing poetry. And he got this little volume, slim little volume together called Gleanings from a Navvy's Scrapbook. He hawked it from door to door in Greenock at the price of 6pence and sold it very well. Because, as I said, it was very rhyming and very attractive to ordinary people. And somehow or another, a copy got to London, and this critic called Andrew Lang, who was one of the main literary critics at the time, hailed it as being a new voice. He was then offered a job by the editor of the Daily Express. So as a young man, about 21, I think he was, when he went to London for the first time as a reporter on the Daily Express. That didn't work out, and he was then without a job. And again, incredibly, the King's librarian, Canon Dalton, took him in to Windsor Castle, gave him a part-time job in the library at Windsor Castle, copying manuscripts. And this gave him a bit more time to write, and he wrote then 2 semi-autobiographical novels, Children of the Dead End and The Rat Pit. These became bestsellers. They were hailed as something entirely new, entirely fresh, and of course they told, for the first time really, they described the conditions of the hiring fairs, where young boys were prodded by farmers to see how strong they were or how weak they were. If they were coughing, they were left there because they would be too weak to work. If they were strong, they were hired. MacGill referred to it as the slave market, and indeed it had a lot of similarities to that. It told then the whole story of in the Tattyhoken fields and then Navvy. So this was a new, they were really very powerful social documents. And MacGill's name, as a result, became a household word in Britain. Now, the books were extremely anti-clerical, and therefore were banned, were not obtainable here. And the priest in the two books was based on one Canon McFadden, who came to Glenties and who had been here a few years, and who is revered in another part of the county, interestingly enough, because of his fight against landlordism. But he was an extremely authoritarian priest, and MacGill as well showed the alliance between the merchants who were fleecing the people by selling them stuff on credit and then getting them to knit socks against that and so on. And MacGill showed the very close links between the merchant class, those who had money, and the church. And of course, as you can imagine, at the time, this was seen as absolutely heretical and unacceptable.
An Irishman, and God forgive me for calling him an Irishman, came home from abroad where he has been working, writing for the papers. This in itself was bad enough, for the papers away abroad have as their first aim and object the destruction of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. But worse was to follow. This man who came back from abroad came to work on his mother's farm as if he meant to help her. Oh, my children, Satan has cunning in his ways. For this man who pretended to work on his mother's farm came to Greenanor with quite another purpose. He saw what she did. He listened to what she said at wake and fair and funeral, and he wrote it down. And what he wrote appeared in the papers in London. My children, he made you the laughingstock of the whole wide world.
One of the incidents which inevitably shaped Canon McFadden's conflict with Patrick MacGill is referred to in MacGill's first novel, Children of the Dead End. When MacGill was less than 12 years of age, his younger brother Dan died suddenly, and it was a great expense in those days to organise a proper family burial. Also, Canon McFadden had placed a levy on each house in the parish so that he could raise money to build this fine parochial house and indeed import a strange new device called a lavatory. Any family which fell behind in paying this levy could be named at the pulpit on a Sunday morning. In the novel, MacGill's father speaks, saying, £8 9 shillings. It's a big penny. The priest was talking to me and says that he wants another pound for his new house at once. I'm over 3 weeks behind, and if he puts a curse on me this time, what am I to do? Shortly after this incident, MacGill was sent to Strabane to the Haring Fair.
It has to be said that, of course, because Glenties was a deaconate, that the bishop paid frequent visits to Glenties to meet the clergy in the area, and therefore a house like this was necessary. It can be argued in that way, but certainly MacGill took full advantage of this. And let's face it, he used a certain license of the writer, and he embellished, of course, as all writers have the liberty to do. And there's a certain amount of embellishment and use of all of this. But nevertheless, there is a fine house there when there was so much poverty at the time. And as you can see from pictures of the time, the poverty among some of the tenantry was very great. He then went off to the First World War, signed up immediately, and wrote several books on his experiences at the front. One of which, to my mind, is one of the best books to come out of the First World War, and there were a lot, called The Great Push. It was written at the front in the heat of battle, and MacGill was a stretcher bearer. He was in the London Irish Rifles. So those sold very well. He came back then, he had married a writer called Margaret Gibbon. She wrote love stories, and she wrote for the Daily Star at the time. So between them, they made quite a lot of money. And their home in London was a centre of socialising for many of the writers of the time. In the 20s, he wrote several other books, but never repeated the same success. And then in 1930, he had a play on in London called Suspense, again based on the First World War. And this was an effort to put it bluntly, to cash in on the success of Journey's End, the famous play based on the First World War. It didn't do terribly well in London because it came after Journey's End. They then went to the States with it and fell on bad times there. The whole family went to the States and basically never returned. And it was complete oblivion. Nobody knew here, not even his relatives here in Donegal, knew where the MacGills had disappeared to. As it transpired, Patrick himself became quite ill with multiple sclerosis, and although he lived until 1963 and lived in Florida, he hadn't the powers of writing anymore. The books have now been republished in Ireland and in Britain, are readily available, and the story is there, and it is a very gripping, poignant story of how this young fellow with very little education came to write his experience and some of the dreadful experience he had.
Well, the folklore of MacGill about Glenties, when he was mentioned over the last 30 years, people didn't think very, very highly of him. You know, they had anecdotes about him which were probably folklore. I remember one man telling me when he first came back to Glenties, he became very famous. You see, he became accepted by the British establishment. He got a librarianship in the Royal Library at Windsor. That was a very strange thing for a man born in the West Donegal. It was a strange place for him to, but he had that measure of acceptance. One of the stories I heard about him, was repeated quite often, was when he first came back to Glenties, he hired a pony and trap and he wore kid gloves and he drove up and down the town to register his success with the people. And there was a kind of dislike of him, always. People didn't even think about his books at all. They just thought him about this returned, arrogant figure. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what I call the folklore of the area.
With the Navvy poet, it's proper to begin with a poem called Digging, I think. When I was in the Soviet Union in 1985...
Throughout the week of the summer school, the activity of poetry manifests itself not only through the works of Patrick MacGill, but also through the lines of living poets, notably Ireland's best-known contemporary poet, Seamus Heaney, who read to an appreciative and attentive capacity audience at the local comprehensive school.
Between my finger and my thumb the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled against the lug. The shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. My God, the old man could handle a spade. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's Bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging.
Night falls, and visitors to the summer school gather in a Glenties bar to join with local people in an evening of traditional entertainment.
One time and now unto the nice Crawley Doll. Sure you know where they make them in West Donegal. No finer or better you'll get anywhere, and the best that there is Crawley Dolls can compare.
The Patrick MacGill Festival is something that I've been going to for quite a long time. But of course we have moved on from Patrick MacGill. We now think in terms of a very creative week in Glenties. People think of Glenties as being a rather sleepy little town, but during this week everyone comes to Glenties.
This is very close to what MacGill would have experienced, but not in a big hall or lounge bar. They would have taken place in a house. There were house parties, flagged floors, bare feet, hobnail boots, knocking the sparks out of it, with the Highlands barn dances and the dances that were danced tonight, just the same as danced in MacGill's town.
At the other end of the town, the excitement is concentrated around the opening of an exhibition of paintings by a daughter of Donegal, now Dublin-based artist, Carmel Brennan, who was invited by the summer school to produce a body of work on the themes of Patrick MacGill's writing. Carmel, you had a very successful opening last night, and you must be pleased because it was your first exhibition back in your native Donegal and also part of the MacGill Summer School.
Yes, yes, I was indeed, Paul, very apprehensive, particularly about the local reaction to such a local character. And it all started a year ago, as you know, when the committee from the MacGill Summer School invited me to read his work and interpret it into picture form. And that I did. I read all his work, and I settled on Children of the Dead End and his book of poetry. This painting based on Patrick MacGill's memories of home, his longings while he was in Scotland, and I called it the Silver-Sandaled Evening. I'm back again in Glenties and the autumn wind is blowing. The silver-sandaled evening skips across the mountains high, but the bogland flowers are fading where of old I watched them growing, and the lean leaves of Lammas-tide are whirling through the sky. MacGill wrote of the evictions in Gweedore. Forever stilled the evening latch, the peat fire's glow is o'er, the ivy flattens on the thatch, for they return no more. In The Dead End, MacGill speaks of his journey to Strabane at 12 years of age. I hung the bundle over my arm and made for the high road leading to Strabane. It was nearly 3 hours' walk to the town, and the morning was grand. The poem, The Calling Voice, from Songs of the Dead End by Patrick MacGill, evoked the spirit and the inspiration of this picture. The horizon, as you see, is hazy. He was setting off on the boat from Derry, not knowing what was ahead of him. He knew there was a horizon there, but didn't know how distinct or clear it was going to be. The picture isn't framed. I didn't want to close in the atmosphere. I wanted the whole thing left open to a whole career ahead of him, a young man looking forward to this world, unknown world.
Patrick MacGill's novel Glenmornan found new life and humour through an imaginative and satirical adaptation for stage by Mike Patterson, performed by members of the Donegal Workshop Theatre.
You haven't much to speak about, Dulcie Gallagher.
I said all I had to say out in the street.
What did you say out in the street, Dulcie Gallagher?
Surely you haven't forgotten it already.
But what's the point of keeping what you said in mind? A person can say anything at a fair and forget it the next day.
Has anyone ever told you before they loved you?
Maybe they have, but that's nothing.
But I mean it. Sheila.
Don't shout, Gallagher! I didn't think that of you.
What's wrong with you, Sheila?
Kissing a girl is not to be thought on if you want to lead a holy and a decent life. They may be kissing women abroad, but it's not for Glenmornan people to follow bad example. It's a sin here to kiss anyone, bar the dead. But a mother may kiss her children until they come to the age of 7. After that, it's a mortal sin for her to kiss them. For myself, I never kissed any woman, bar me wife, and that was just before she was laid to rest.
With Glenties' experience of the controversy surrounding MacGill's writing, it was surprising to discover that the infamous Molly Bloom soliloquy from James Joyce Ulysses was not only being performed deliciously wickedly by Dublin actress Caroline Rothwell in the local Highlands Hotel, but was also the subject of an exhibition of ink and pastel studies by the painter Breege Clark.
I was looking for a model for Molly Bloom to do the series of paintings, and I went to see Caroline Rothwell in her performance of the Molly Bloom soliloquy in Trinity, and she brought across to me that this was just the type of Molly Bloom I wanted to depict. And so I went back to see it a second time and asked her if she would pose for me, and reluctantly she came. But when we got working together, we worked together for about 3 weeks, she got very enthusiastic, and I feel that she added a lot to it because she was able to prompt me in what I should be doing and depicting, and we really enjoyed the experience of working together.
It's a wonder I'm not an old shrivelled hag before me time, living with him so cold, never embracing me, except sometimes when he's asleep, the wrong end of me, not knowing, I suppose, who he has. Any man that would kiss a woman's bottom, I'd throw me hat at him. After that, he'd kiss anything unnatural. Where we haven't one atom of any kind of expression in us. All of us the same. 2 lumps of lard. Before ever I do that to a man. The dirty brutes. The mere thought is enough.
Throughout his life, Patrick MacGill wrote about Donegal and the countryside he was never to return to. I have seen the crimson dawning of a Spanish morning glow. I have cowered before the menace of the wild. I have seen the sapphire sunlight tint the everlasting snow, where December's virgin granaries are piled. I have heard the mountain torrents hurtle riotous in wrath. I have tramped the roads to London and to Rome. But I'd rather have my childhood and the narrow moorland path, the path that leads to happiness and home.